The story begins inside the royal palace, where a young boy named Van suddenly wakes up in a large bed. As he lifts his hands in front of his face, he feels confused and uneasy, wondering why his hands look so small and weak. That is when the truth slowly sinks in, and he realizes that he has been reincarnated from his old and miserable life. In his previous life, Van lived a dull and empty existence. He worked a dead-end job that paid very little, barely enough to cover rent and basic bills, and every day felt the same as the last. His life was full of stress, boredom, and regret. But for some reason, the universe decided to give him a second chance and brought him into another world. Reborn as the young lord of a remote village, Van carefully climbs out of bed and steps onto a small wooden stool so he can look out the window and get a proper view of the kingdom outside. Tall buildings, wide land, and calm skies spread before him. However, before he can enjoy the view for long, his maid, Till, rushes over in panic and tells him to get down at once because it is dangerous. Van is supposed to be only 2 years old at this point, so Till freezes in shock when he calmly responds to her using clear and advanced words. Hearing his own voice, Van suddenly realizes that he also has memories from the time he has already spent living in this world. Those memories mix with his past life memories in Japan, fully confirming that he has truly been reincarnated. About an hour later, Van sits down for dinner with his father and siblings. The room is quiet, filled with an awkward silence. After a few long minutes, Van's father, Jalpa, decides to break the silence by asking his second son, Jard, what he plans to study that day. Jard pauses for a moment before answering that he will be studying fire magic and battle formations. Jalpa then asks the third son, Sesto, the same question, and Sesto replies that he will be studying magic as well. Finally, Jalpa turns to Van and asks him what he will be studying. Van answers honestly, saying that there are still many things he does not understand, so he wants to first learn about the country's history and culture. Van's siblings shudder in disbelief after hearing his answer. They cannot understand how their 2-year-old brother is sounding much smarter than they are. Jalpa suddenly bursts into laughter and admits that he is impressed by Van's intelligence and promise at such a young age. He shares that he has high hopes that Van will inherit a strong talent for fire magic, just like he and Van's mother did. Jalpa explains that the magic aptitude test will take place when Van turns 8, and he tells Van not to disappoint him. In this world, magical aptitude is everything. Magic mainly comes in 4 elements: fire, water, wind, and earth. While other types of magic do exist, any magic outside these 4 elements is heavily looked down upon. After breakfast, Van goes to his study room, where the maids give him a simple explanation of how life and society work in this world. Just as they finish speaking, the head butler, Esparta, suddenly walks into the room and drops a large stack of books onto Van's desk. Esparta is an exceptionally skilled butler who has served Van's father for many years. Even so, Van is still very afraid of him. Esparta tells Van that he already knows Van has started learning how to read and do simple math, so he asks how far Van has progressed. Van honestly admits that he still cannot read properly, and when it comes to math, he can only add and subtract. Esparta knows that Van is capable of much more, so he decides to personally take over as his tutor. Esparta's lessons quickly turn into a living nightmare for Van. The training is strict, long, and exhausting, with no room for excuses or rest. However, because of these harsh lessons, Van learns how to read and write in just a few weeks. After 2 full years of non-stop studying, Van finally turns 4 years old and begins sword training. At first, he is absolutely terrible at it. He loses again and again, even to the maid during practice sessions. Despite this, Van does not give up and continues training every single day. By the time Van turns 5 years old, his hard work finally pays off. He starts sparring with older boys who are training to become soldiers, and he is able to fight them evenly. Van notices that their movements are simple and easy to predict, so he defeats them again and again without much trouble. The other children are completely shocked by his performance and start believing that he might be some kind of chosen one. Beyond that, many of the kids grow to like Van because, unlike his brothers, he actually talks to commoners and builds real friendships with them. Not long after, Van decides to take a short break to drink some water. At that moment, the deputy knight commander, D, walks in and politely asks Van to show him his hands. D carefully examines them and is shocked to see that Van has no calluses or bruises. This suggests that Van has not been training with a sword for very long. Van admits that this is true and explains that he has been very busy with studying lately. D tells Van that Esparta has been making him study nearly 3 times more than normal. He says he is willing to talk to Esparta about reducing Van's study time and increasing his training time, since life is not only about books. D then vows that if Van gets more time to train, he will shape him into the greatest swordsman ever. Van replies that speaking to Esparta will not be necessary, since he believes he can manage both studying and training. D agrees with him, but suggests that he should become Van's training instructor to make sure Van Van is following the right path. Training with D quickly turns into another living nightmare. D puts Van through extremely intense drills with almost no time to rest. Even so, Van cannot deny that, despite how hard everything has been, every day since his reincarnation has been enjoyable. For the first time in his life, he feels a sense of fulfillment that he never had in his past life. With this realization, Van makes up his mind that he will enjoy a fun and meaningful life in this new world. 1 year later, Van turns 6 years old. By now, the endless routine of studying and training one after the other starts to feel dull and exhausting. He realizes that if things continue this way, he will never live the fun life he promised himself. From that moment on, Van decides that he will start acting like a normal child and spend time having fun. One day, he tells the maid that he wants to go out and play, so she takes him to the market. Van is amazed by the many different people, sounds, and items being sold all around him. While walking through the market, Van becomes distracted by a massive building known as the Merry Chamber of Commerce. As he stares at it in awe, a disturbing scene suddenly unfolds nearby. A child in shackles and chains is dragged through the marketplace. Van immediately asks the man why the child is chained up. The man coldly replies that he is selling his son as a slave, saying that since the child belongs to him, he can do whatever he wants. The maid explains to Van that it is common for poor families to sell children they cannot afford to raise, as slaves make their lives easier. Van admits that it is cruel and painful to see, but also feels there is little he can do to change it. At that moment, a woman named Rosalie approaches and greets Van, saying it is an honor to serve him. Van asks her how much the man would receive for selling his child. Rosalie explains that the price depends on magical aptitude. After learning that the boy has a thieving aptitude, which is considered very low, she says the child would sell for no more than 3 silver coins. Upon hearing this, the man becomes furious and begins kicking his son repeatedly, yelling at him for being worthless. He then grabs the boy and says they are going to another shop. Suddenly, Van steps forward and stops the man, announcing that he will buy the boy for 5 silver coins. The man immediately agrees, takes the money, and leaves without looking back. Van then kneels in front of the boy and introduces himself. The boy introduces himself as Kamshin. Van tells Kamshin that he is free to go wherever he wants. Van never intended to truly own him. He only bought him so he could set him free. However, when Van learns that Kamshin has nowhere to go, he suggests that Kamshin come live with him. One of the guards speaks up and warns Van that the Marquis may not approve of him bringing a strange boy home. However, if the boy is registered as Van's slave, there should be no issue. Van asks Kamshin if that would be acceptable, and Kamshin agrees. From that moment on, Kamshin officially becomes Van's slave. Rosalie then informs them that before anything is final, they must first complete the slave contract. Both Van and Kamshin stretch their hands forward at the same time, following Rosalie's instructions. As the slave contract is formed, a glowing mark appears on the back of Kamshin's palm. This mark is the proof of the slave contract, and it will not disappear as long as the contract remains active. Once everything is finished, Van and Kamshin head into the Chamber of Commerce together so Kamshin can get a clean set of clothes and no longer look like a chained slave from the streets. A few days later, back at the palace, Van is finally about to enjoy a rare moment of peace as he reaches for a cookie. Just as he is about to take a bite, Kamshin walks into the room and informs him that D has arrived for training. Van immediately freezes. Without hesitation, he hands the cookie to Kamshin and tells him to go inform D that he is not around. Van knows very well that there is no way he can survive another brutal training session. Kamshin does as he is told and goes outside to tell D that Van is unavailable. D is clearly disappointed, but since he still wants to train someone, he decides to take Kamshin instead and begins training him in Van's place. 2 more years pass after that, and Van finally turns 8 years old. This means it is time for his magical aptitude to be officially tested. The upcoming test becomes the talk of the entire town. Nobles, servants, soldiers, and even merchants are all eager to see the results. Many people believe Van will show strong talent, especially since his parents were gifted in fire magic. Even Van's father, Jalpa, is confident that Van will at least possess an aptitude for fire magic. However, on the day of the test, everyone is left completely stunned. To their shock, Van does not have an aptitude for fire, water, wind, or earth. Instead, he only has an aptitude for production magic, which is widely considered the worst and most useless type of magic in the world. The atmosphere turns cold instantly. Jalpa becomes furious upon realizing that his son has turned out to be a complete failure in his eyes. In a fit of rage, he draws his sword and prepares to kill Van on the spot. Van is frozen in fear, unable to move or speak, his mind completely blank. Just as his father is about to strike, the eldest son, Mersha, steps in front of Van and stops him. Mersha suggests an alternative solution instead. He proposes that Van should be put in charge of a remote village within their territory. Mersha explains that the village is far too isolated to grow properly, and since it was only recently acquired, many of the people living there are not loyal to their family. Placing one of their own as lord there would help secure the villagers' loyalty. Jalpa pauses and considers the idea. After a moment, he realizes that it is actually a reasonable solution. He sheathes his sword and declares that Van will become the lord of that land. Jalpa then turns away coldly and tells Van to pack his belongings and leave as soon as possible, saying that there is no place for someone useless in his home. With that, he walks away without looking back. After his father leaves, Mersha bows deeply and apologizes to Van for suggesting something so humiliating. Van tells him there is no need to apologize, because if it were not for Mersha stepping in, he would be dead. The next day, Van packs up his things and prepares to depart for the remote village. Surprisingly, he feels a sense of excitement. He believes there will not be much work there, and for once, he may finally be able to live the fun and relaxed life he has always wanted. Everything seems to be going smoothly until Dee and Esparta announce that they will be coming along to keep an eye on Van's training and studying. Van lets out a long sigh of frustration, already knowing that these two will make his life a living hell once again. To make matters worse, his favorite maid also decides to come along, saying she cannot bear to be separated from him. With all preparations complete, Van steps into the carriage and begins his journey toward a new life, hoping that this time he will finally be able to have some fun. After Van rides through the forest in his carriage for a while, he decides to pass the time by trying out some production magic. After focusing for a bit, he successfully manages to produce a tiny sword in his hand. Kamzan watches this happen but isn't really surprised by the result, because he already knows that Van has a natural aptitude for production magic and learns these things quickly. That aside, since Van has been banished from his home and stripped of his former status, he brings up something that has been bothering him for a while. He tells Kamzan that there's no longer any need for him to continue working as his slave. Van explains that if Kamzan doesn't like traveling with him or doesn't feel comfortable staying by his side anymore, he could simply release him from his slave contract and send him on his way to live freely. However, Kamzan immediately refuses the offer without hesitation. He firmly reminds Van that he has already dedicated his life to him and that this decision wasn't made lightly. Kamzan goes on to say that he would be more than willing to lay his life down if it meant ensuring Van's safety, no matter what situation they find themselves in. Hearing this, Van has no choice but to accept Kamzan's resolve, even though it makes him feel slightly uneasy. Suddenly, their carriage comes to an abrupt stop, jolting everyone inside. When Van looks outside to see what's going on, he notices that the village up ahead is currently under attack. The knights guarding Van quickly assume that the people attacking the village must be bandits, or perhaps some kind of washed-up mercenaries looking for easy loot. Dee carefully examines the enemy formation and counts their numbers, noticing that there are roughly 50 attackers in total. Based on this, he figures that if they were to combine their forces and charge in together, they would likely be able to take the attackers down without too much trouble. From a purely tactical standpoint, the numbers seemed manageable. However, one of the adventurers traveling with them, a man named Ortho, strongly disagrees with this approach. Ortho reminds Dee that their job was very clear from the beginning. They were only hired to protect and defend Van in the event that he himself was in danger. Since Van is currently unharmed and not being targeted directly, Ortho argues that there's no reason for them to risk their lives by engaging in a battle that isn't part of their contract. Dee grows visibly frustrated after hearing this, but despite that, he declares that he's going to fight anyway. He says he can't just stand by and watch while innocent villagers are slaughtered right in front of him. Even if no one else joins him, he's prepared to charge in alone. Before leaving, he asks the adventurers to at least stay behind and focus on protecting Van in case the situation takes a turn for the worse. Before Dee can move out, Esparta suddenly speaks up and shuts the idea down. Esparta bluntly tells Dee that throwing his life away like that would be incredibly stupid, especially considering his importance. He explains that Dee dying here would severely cripple the future of the kingdom's military forces. As a well-known and highly respected elemental mage, Esparta instead proposes a more calculated plan. He suggests erecting a powerful defensive wall around their position to keep Van safe, while the adventurers provide long-range attacks from behind the barrier to thin out the enemy forces safely and efficiently. And once the enemy's attention is fully focused on them, Dee and the other knights would surprise the attackers by launching a sudden assault from the right flank. Esparta is fairly certain that this strategy would guarantee their victory if executed properly. However, Van quickly realizes what this plan truly implies. In order for the enemy to focus on a single point, Esparta himself would have to remain behind and deliberately act as bait. Esparta confirms Van's concern without hesitation, explaining that this is the only way the plan could possibly work. If he doesn't serve as the decoy, then Dee and his men would be forced into a direct confrontation and would most likely end up dying in vain. Hearing this, Van immediately understands the weight of those words. If things go wrong, it would mean Esparta sacrificing his life. Van realizes that losing both the kingdom's greatest strategist and its most powerful warrior would be an irreversible blow. Without them, there would be no way to properly develop or protect this land in the future. Because of that, Van steps forward and offers to act as the decoy himself instead. Till immediately shuts that idea down the moment she hears it, saying that she would rather be the decoy herself than allow Van to put his life on the line. Kamzan agrees with her completely and feels the same way, standing firmly by Van's side. Even so, Van calmly tells both of them that he cares about them deeply, and because of that, he absolutely cannot afford to put either of them in harm's way. Van then explains his own plan. He would ride out in the carriage and attack the enemy head-on, drawing their attention, while the rest of them would strike from long range and from both flanks at once. As he walks away, Van reminds everyone that he underwent intense sword training for years, so there's no way he would go down that easily. But deep down, he also admits to himself that if he were to die here, he would be fine with it, as long as it was for a noble cause. Ortho stares at Van in disbelief after hearing this. Van's words cause Ortho to flash back to the time he was still at the guild, when he first received the request to guard Van. Back then, he absolutely hated the idea of protecting a noble, because he believed all nobles were rotten to the core. Still, he accepted the request anyway, since he planned to keep operating in the Fertio March for the foreseeable future. But then, in that memory, Van appeared before him, bowed deeply, and sincerely expressed his gratitude for Ortho accepting the request to protect him. Van continued to praise Ortho, showering him with genuine compliments. At the time, Ortho found himself blushing, realizing for the first time that not all nobles were heartless or corrupt. Back in the present, Ortho steps forward and places himself in front of Van, declaring that there's absolutely no way they're going to let a kid like him risk his life like that. Dee and Esparta both step forward as well, openly agreeing with Ortho's stance. With that settled, Esparta decides to revise the strategy entirely and comes up with a new plan on the spot. First, Esparta would erect a powerful defensive wall. From behind it, the adventurers would unleash long-range attacks. Then Dee and his men would charge in from the left flank, while Ortho and his group would storm the enemy from the right flank at the same time. The plan begins immediately. Esparta quickly raises the defensive wall, and once it's in place, the adventurers begin firing arrows from behind it, wiping out the first wave of bandits almost instantly. The bandits are completely caught off guard, as the remaining attackers finally notice the wall and attempt to regroup and launch a counterattack. Dee and his men rush in, cutting down yet another wave with their swords. However, amid the chaos, the leader of the bandits suddenly breaks through and charges toward the other side of the wall. He's just about to strike Pluriel when Van steps in at the very last second. Van uses his sword skills and strikes the bandit directly in his Achilles heel, causing him to collapse to his knees in agony. Immediately after that, Kamzan leaps in and delivers the final blow, ending the threat once and for all. Shortly after that, the remaining bandits are all tied up and the threat to the village is completely neutralized. With the danger gone and the quest officially fulfilled, some of the adventurers decide to head back home so they can take on more quests elsewhere. However, Ortho is deeply impressed by Van's swordsmanship as well as his leadership skills during the battle. Because of that, Ortho becomes curious about Van and decides to stick around for a while longer, offering to help him out in any way he can. Ortho's party members share the same sentiment, so they also decide to stay behind and lend their support. After everything settles down, Van decides to formally address the village. He steps forward and introduces himself as their new lord to the village chief, a man named Rondo. Rondo expresses his deep gratitude toward Van for saving their village, and then goes on to explain that this isn't the first time something like this has happened. In fact, the village has been attacked multiple times just within this year alone. Rondo believes that their village is being targeted so frequently because back when they were still part of Ferdinando County, there were knights regularly patrolling the area, which kept them safe from bandits and other threats. Now that those patrols are gone, they no longer have anyone left to protect them. Van apologizes to Rondo and the villagers for their current situation and explains that this is most likely because the Marquis is unaware of the conditions in smaller, more remote villages like theirs. Van assures them that now that he has become the lord in charge of this land, he won't ignore their struggles. He then suggests that there are 3 concrete measures they can take in order to protect the village moving forward. The first option would be to produce something so valuable that the kingdom would be unable to afford ignoring them. The second option would be to earn enough money to hire mercenaries who could defend the village. And the third option would be to focus on developing and improving the village itself, strengthening it so it can stand on its own. But then, one of the young girls from the village speaks up and says that they have already thought about all of those solutions before. However, she adds that while those ideas sound good in theory, they are far easier to talk about than to actually put into practice. Van tries to encourage them and tells the villagers not to worry because he is here here now as their new lord, and he fully intends to protect and develop their land. Unfortunately, the villagers don't seem very impressed by his words alone. Seeing this, Esparta and Dee step forward to reinforce Van's claim. They introduce themselves properly, stating that they are the chief commander and the head butler of the kingdom. They assure Rondo and the villagers that they truly have nothing to fear. Hearing this immediately boosts the villagers' morale, but they soon raise another concern. They ask what is going to be done about taxes, explaining that it has been extremely difficult for them to continue paying 30% of their harvest. Van responds by saying that, for the time being, the tax rate will be reduced to just 10%. He explains that securing a stable and livable environment for the villagers is far more important right now. The villagers are shocked to hear that the tax rate has been cut to less than half of what it used to be, and they express their gratitude toward Van. As for security, Esparta immediately erects a sturdy stone wall around the village to protect it from bandits and raiders. He then adds that having a moat would make their defenses even stronger. Dee and the other knights tell Van that they'll take care of that as well. Van turns back to the villagers and assures them that as long as they do their best to cooperate with him, he can almost guarantee that this village will be reborn into something far greater than it ever was before. Shortly after that, Van decides to test out his production magic. After concentrating for a while, he creates several wooden blocks. However, these are no ordinary wooden blocks. They are actually made of nanofibers, an incredibly strong material. The blocks are so durable that when Ortho tries smashing one with his sword, it doesn't even leave a scratch. Van then spends the rest of the day using his production magic to create weapons, all of which look incredibly high quality. Seeing this, Till starts to wonder whether he might run out of mana from using so much magic. Van reassures her he's fine. He recalls hearing that production magic usually consumes an enormous amount of mana, to the point where it's difficult for an ordinary person to create even a single item. After that, he decides to gift a sword to Kamzan, and Kamzan is so happy about it that he promises to treasure it forever. Later that night, Van sits by a campfire and realizes that his body feels extremely sore after spending so much time camping outdoors. He looks over at Till and Kamzan and knows that even though they're acting like they're fine, they're probably exhausted as well. Because of that, Van decides it's time to build a proper house. The next day, Van and his group begin arranging the nano blocks to construct a house. When Rondo sees this, he comments that it would be the perfect location for the Lord's mansion, which makes Van genuinely happy. Van then starts using his production magic to analyze whether it's possible to build a house large enough. He carefully examines every block and every square inch of space, and once he finally gets the hang of it, he activates his magic. Everyone watches in stunned silence as Van creates an entire mansion in the blink of an eye. While the others are completely shocked by the sight, Van can't help but think to himself that it might have ended up being a little bigger than he originally intended. The villagers cheer in amazement at how Van was able to build such a beautiful mansion in only a few seconds. At that moment, Van realizes that his production magic is far better suited for ruling and managing a village than elemental magic, and he finds this idea very interesting. On top of that, he feels that people would be more comfortable living under a lord who focuses on production magic rather than strong offensive magic. Kamzan then runs over to him and says he would rather live in Van's village than in Lord Jalpa's terrible kingdom. But Van does not take it too seriously because he knows Kamzan is clearly biased toward him anyway. Esparta walks up to Van and explains that what the people of this village truly need is a lord who can improve their daily lives, and because of that, Esparta believes Van is the best possible choice for them. Dee and Ortho agree, since they are still shocked that he was able to create a house out of nothing at all. Van tells them not to worry because he can build houses for everyone as long as they can bring him enough lumber. As soon as they hear this, the adventurers and the knights become very motivated and decide to turn it into a competition. After that, Rondo and the other villagers complain to Van and ask him to make houses for them as well. Van looks at their homes and sees that they are in very bad condition, so even though he knows he will be extremely tired, he still chooses to help and promises to make new homes for every single villager. When they hear this, the villagers begin to celebrate, realizing that they are all about to receive brand new homes. Van feels happy about it, because the production magic that everyone once looked down on is now helping him bring smiles to people's faces. Van immediately starts working and uses his magic to fix and rebuild every house until they all look good as new. Van explains that he made all the homes the same to avoid unfair differences, and that this will be enough for now, but in the future he will be able to build homes that fit everyone's personal needs. The villagers are simply happy to finally see real change coming to their poor village. They were extremely grateful to Van as well, and seeing their gratitude made him feel truly happy inside. Putting that aside for the moment, Van decided to build a simple public bath next to his manor, and the citizens were very excited and pleased when they saw it being completed. Van had had originally created the bath for his own personal use, but he felt glad knowing that the villagers liked it so much and could enjoy it too. Even though Van did not build the bath completely by himself, he received help from both Kamsin and Pluriel while working on it. Later that night, Van finally gets some quiet time alone in the bath together with Kamsin. After Kamsin steps out of the bath, Van notices that Kamsin has gained some muscle, which makes Van feel a bit jealous and wish that he also had muscles like that. Kamsin realizes that he really has gained some muscle, but he admits that he is still quite skinny when compared to D. At that moment, D and his friends suddenly appear without any clothes and suggest that everyone should take a bath together, claiming that men bond better while naked. Van immediately understands that this is his cue to get out of the bath, but D grabs him and pulls him back in, insisting that he stay. After a few long and awkward hours of that strange situation, Van finally goes to his bedroom and lies down on his soft and fluffy bed, feeling calm, relaxed, and satisfied with how everything has been going lately. The next day, Van feels happy when he sees that the knights and the adventurers worked very hard to dig a deep trench, but there is still no water in it to turn it into a proper moat. Because of this problem, Van realizes that they need to find or create a water source as quickly as possible. With that in mind, Van comes up with a new plan where Esparta will use his magic to divert water from the river by creating a large trench, while D and the others continue extending it by digging manually. Van plans to use his production magic to strengthen and reinforce the trench once it is completed, but as he watches them work, he slowly starts to feel more and more annoyed when he notices that D seems to be enjoying the digging far more than he should. Even so, Van is still glad to see everyone working together toward a shared goal. Van reminds himself that he just needs to finish this task so he can finally live the laid-back and peaceful life he has always wanted. Van estimates that the digging should take about a week, but by the time the sun sets, he is shocked at how fast D and the others worked, as they have already dug so far that he can clearly see the next village in the distance. Van suggests that they stop working for the day, especially since Kamsin and the others look barely alive from exhaustion after all that digging. What surprises him the most is that D and Esparta still seem to have enough stamina to continue working without rest. By the next day, the canal meant to store and guide the water is fully completed, and when the gate is finally opened, everyone watches in amazement as the water flows smoothly and steadily through the channel. Not long after that, the entire village is successfully surrounded by a moat filled with water, but after seeing this result, Van decides it would be smarter to create a lake behind the village in case heavy rain causes the water level to rise and overflow. Esparta agrees with this idea and points out that the lake would also be very useful during times of drought, making it an important addition for the village's future. Shortly after, the lake is completed, and the citizens begin to celebrate at the sight of it because they know that this means they will no longer have to worry about getting water ever again. Van feels happy too, and with this achievement, he becomes certain that life in the village will now be much easier and more comfortable for everyone. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, a woman named Panamera is seen traveling toward a remote village together with a noble's daughter named Art. Just by observing them, it is clear that the two share a strong bond, and Art seems to trust Panamera completely, seeing her as someone reliable and dependable. Back in the village, Van continues working tirelessly and has just used his production magic to erect a giant rampart, which everyone finds to be extremely impressive. Even so, Van feels that the rampart can be made much better and safer, so he adds long-range ballistic shooters with protective armor in front, so that if any intruders were to attack, they would be able to defend the village while remaining protected from enemy attacks. While Van considers all of this to be fairly basic, everyone else is left in total shock by it. The villagers now begin to realize that their once run-down, small village is no longer just a village. It has transformed into a small fortress, capable of defending itself from danger. D considers all of this and reflects that if Lord Jalpa had realized Van was capable of such incredible power, he would never have banished him in the first place, and might even have made Van an advisor or the head of the house. However, Esparta feels that Lord Jalpa would have banished Van anyway because his abilities are not suited for offense and conquering lands. D strongly disagrees, arguing that war is not only about offense, but should also include strong defenses, and that Van's power could make him the most powerful member of the royal family. They continue to argue about this for quite some time until Van interrupts them and tells them that debating over it will do no good, and that all they need to do now is fight as hard as they can using what they already have. Everyone agrees with him and focuses on the task at hand. A few hours later, Till prepares a delicious lunch for Van, and as expected, Van finds it to be extremely tasty. During the meal, Esparta brings up the concern that they need to find a way to generate income for the village. Van considers it for a moment and figures that he can manage any leftover homes and furniture, and the crops the farmers are planting should be more than enough, so there may not even be be a need for a stronger source of income. However, Van quickly realizes that one downside of this plan is that he will not have the ingredients needed for the baked desserts he loves so much. Because of this, he advises that they start brainstorming ideas for what the village can produce or sell as soon as possible. After tossing several ideas around, Van does not find any of them promising, and he realizes that finding something unique and valuable from this village will not be easy. The next day, Van suggests that Till and Kamzan test out the new weapons he obtained for them. When Kamzan attempts to test his sword against a shield made from orc material, the sword slices the shield completely in half. Even though Kamzan barely put any effort into the strike, Zara immediately breaks into tears because he had just built the shield and never expected it to break, especially since it was made from one of the toughest materials in the kingdom. Fortunately, Van quickly uses his magic to repair the shield, restoring it completely, and Zara becomes happy and relieved once again. Just then, Ortho rolls in with a wagon full of ores and tells Van about the many monsters he found in the forest, which is how he was able to collect all of these ores. Van asks if he can test out some of the iron ore, and Ortho agrees without any problem. Van then uses the iron ore to craft some iron, and Zara is immediately impressed by the result. Excited, Zara asks Van to help him by making a sword as well. Van agrees because he feels a little guilty about having broken Zara's shield the first time. He concentrates carefully, thinking about the shape, balance, and density of the sword he wants to make. Using his skill, Van creates the best looking iron sword he can, and Zara absolutely loves it. Encouraged by this, Van goes on to make an even longer sword, and the other adventurers also want some for themselves. Van tells them to go gather minerals, and he promises to make swords for all of them. Pluriel examines the sword Van made and realizes that the quality is so high that it could probably sell for a very high price. Meanwhile, Esparta notices that one of the ores they mined is mithril, which surprises him because it is very unusual for mithril to be found in the forest. This leads him to believe that there must be a nearby dungeon that has not yet been discovered. Considering that the area has not been surveyed in a long time, they all agree that it is very likely. Van smiles at this idea because he knows that discovering a new dungeon would make the village more famous and important. Normally, when the Adventurer Guild learns about a new dungeon, they open a branch in the nearest town and send a group of elite adventurers known as the Chivalric Order. The problem, however, is that their village does not yet have the resources or infrastructure to support such a branch, so that plan cannot work. Alerting the kingdom is also not an option because, since Van was the black sheep and banished, if they discover that the land he was sent to is valuable, they might send him somewhere else. Nobody wants that to happen. Pluriel then suggests that Van should first grow the village and build all the necessary facilities and amenities before the dungeon is discovered, which would make it much harder for the House of Ferdio to interfere. Everyone agrees with this plan, and Van thanks them for coming to an agreement. Shortly after, Van and Till are taking a casual stroll when suddenly a group of armored lizards heads straight toward the village. In response, Van orders everyone to get inside the rampart, and he raises the gates to protect the villagers. Seeing the fear in everyone's eyes, Van reassures them not to worry, telling them that he will fight for all of them. However, he knows he cannot win this battle using strength alone, so he asks the villagers to lend him their strength as well, so that together they can defend and protect the village from the approaching threat. The people of the village are not willing to just stand back and let Van fight their battles alone, so they speak up and suggest that they should all fight together as one group. They believe that working together will give them a better chance to survive. Van feels very grateful for their support and their courage, and he thanks them for being willing to help. He then tells everyone to move quickly and get to the ramparts so they can prepare for the coming attack. Everyone becomes busy right away and follows Van's orders without wasting time. At the same time, since Orthos' party is not around because they went out earlier to go hunting, so they are not there to help at this moment. Van prepares himself and gets ready to head up to the rampart so he can take his position and help lead the defense. However, Till stops him at the very last second because she is deeply worried about his safety and does not want him to put himself in danger. She shows clear concern for him and tries to hold him back. Seeing this, Dee steps in to take Van's place for now. Dee tells Van that he will go up to the rampart instead and give a report on what he sees. Dee then heads up to the rampart to check the situation with his own eyes. After taking a careful look from the rampart, Dee gives his report to everyone. He says that there are about 40 armored lizards heading straight toward the village. This number is far higher than what Van expected, so Van is very surprised and clearly worried by this news. Dee also understands how serious this situation is because he knows from experience that even a group of skilled and experienced veterans would struggle to take down even a single armored lizard. Knowing this makes the situation feel even more dangerous and hopeless, even though the odds are heavily against them. Dee still refuses to give up. He tells himself and the others that that giving up is not an option. He orders everyone to prepare the ballistae and get ready to fire as soon as possible. D tells them that he has never lost a single battle before in his life, and he is not about to let this battle become the first one he ever loses. His words help raise everyone's fighting spirit and give them the courage to keep going. They fire several ballista bolts toward the enemy, and they are able to shoot down 10 of the armored lizards. D is extremely shocked when he sees this happen. He quickly realizes that this clearly shows how powerful the ballista bolts made by Van truly are. He did not expect them to be this strong, and the results surprise everyone watching. Shortly after that, they reload the ballistae and fire again. They manage to take down the next wave of armored lizards, which makes everyone feel happy and hopeful. However, that feeling does not last long. They soon realize that they have run out of iron bullets, and some of the armored lizards are still alive and still moving closer to the village. At that moment, no one knows what to do next, and fear begins to spread among them. D can clearly tell that if they do not act right now, their entire village will be destroyed. Because of this, he starts thinking about jumping into the battle himself and fighting directly to protect the village. Just when D is thinking about doing this, Van calls out to him and tells him to use the wooden bullets instead. The others are confused when they hear this idea. They believe that wooden bullets will not do much damage because the armored lizards have skin that is as hard and strong as steel. To them, using wood sounds like a bad idea and a waste of time. However, D knows better than to doubt Van's judgment. He trusts Van's thinking and believes there must be a reason for this plan. Because of this trust, D orders the knights to load the ballistae with wooden bullets. To everyone's complete surprise, the wooden bullets strike the armored lizards directly through the head. The shots are powerful enough to pierce through and defeat them, and they wipe out the remaining armored lizards at last. D is honestly amazed to see this happen with his own eyes. He cannot believe that wooden bullets were able to finish them off so effectively. After D announces to everyone that they have won and that the enemy has been defeated, the entire village begins to celebrate their success together, feeling relieved. The fact that they managed to pull all of this off by using as little bullets as possible and doing it all without suffering a single casualty almost feels anticlimactic to D. Because of this, D starts to believe even more strongly that Van is going to be a very big deal around here. To D, it becomes clear that Van is not just an ordinary lord, but someone who will greatly change the future of the village. Later that day, everyone begins taking the skin and meat off the armored lizards. The villagers work together to properly cut, clean, and prepare everything they can from the monsters. After Van sees how much meat they managed to get from the armored lizards, he suggests that they should have a big feast that night to celebrate their victory from earlier that day. He believes that everyone deserves to relax, eat well, and enjoy themselves after such a dangerous battle. During the feast, everything goes very well, and the villagers are extremely happy. They are thankful and glad that they have gotten a lord like Van posted to their village. Many of them feel that they truly could not have wished for anyone better to protect and lead them. The mood is cheerful, and the people feel safer and more hopeful about the future because of Van's actions and leadership. Later on, while sitting around a campfire, Ortho talks to Van about the value of the armored lizards. Ortho explains that if they were to sell the armored lizards to a merchant, they would normally be able to get about 20 gold for just one armored lizard. However, in this case, most of the meat would spoil before it could be sold properly. When transport fees and other costs are also subtracted, Ortho says they would really be looking at only about 8 gold per piece in the end. Van then does the math in his head based on how much meat they have collected. He realizes that after selling everything, they should be looking at around 300 gold in total. In his former life in Japan, that amount of money would have been equal to about 300 million yen, which makes him think that he is going to be incredibly rich. The thought of having that much money surprises and excites him for a moment. However, Esparta quickly informs Van that whenever a village makes more than 100 gold, they are required to pay 50% of it as taxes to the marquis. Hearing this news, Van becomes upset because he realizes that he is going to lose half of the money. But what worries him even more than losing gold is the attention this could bring. If they sell this much meat, the village will be noticed very easily by higher authorities. Van begins to worry that when his father learns that their village is holding on to so much wealth and success, his father may exile him away to another village. If that happens, Van believes he will never be able to live the calm and peaceful life that he has always wanted for himself. The idea of being forced to move and lose his quiet life troubles him deeply. However, Esparta points out that there is one possible way they could keep this whole situation a secret. She explains that they could give his elder brother, Mercia, the glory for defeating the armored lizards. By doing this, the credit would go to Mercia instead, and their village would not draw as much attention. This would help protect Van and the village from unwanted notice. Van thinks about this plan and realizes that it is actually a very good idea. He agrees that giving the credit to Mercia makes sense, especially since Mercia has not yet added any major achievement to his name. The next day, two merchants arrived at the village. They had been told that this was just a small, remote village, but when they saw it, they were shocked. The village was much more developed than they had expected. On arrival, the merchants introduced themselves as Bell and Rango, representing a popular trading company. After that, Van invited them into the village to take a closer look. The merchants were surprised to see the large number of armored lizard skins the village had collected. They had not expected such a small village to be able to defeat so many armored lizards. In fact, the sight of it made them a little scared of the village's power. Bell quickly agreed to buy all of the skins and said that he would send some men to carry everything back with him. Van was delighted to hear this, since the meat would not stay fresh for long. He even told them that they could take some of it for free if needed. In return, Van told the merchants about the high-quality weapons he had been producing in the village. He asked if they would be interested in buying some. Bell and Rango examined the weapons carefully and were very surprised by their quality. Impressed, they agreed to buy all of the weapons that Van had made. After that, Van asked if they could help promote his weapons to increase sales. Bell and Rango hesitated for a moment. Their hesitation made Van realize that they had originally been planning to create a monopoly on the weapons. However, he now considered them naive because he had already seen this coming. Van calmly told them that it would be best to find a way to make more profit first, before promotion caused sales to skyrocket too quickly. He suggested that they set up a shop directly in his village. Bell and Rango were surprised that Van would allow them to do that, and they were very thankful for his generosity. Shortly after, Van used less than 5 minutes to build a shop for them. Both merchants were even more shocked to see how quickly he had constructed it. Meanwhile, Art and Panamera were seen outside the village gates, eager to find out whether the rumors about the village lord being a prodigy were true. Later that day, Esparta talks to Van about the village's growth. She suggested that, with the way things were developing, he should start planning for the village to eventually have about 10,000 people. Van honestly thought that number sounded excessive. However, Esparta explained that, with the way the village was growing, it seemed about right. He noted that they would need many people to guard the village, protect its facilities, and maintain order overall. Van trusted Esparta's judgment. If he was suggesting such a plan, it had to be a good idea. Van then thought about redesigning the town into a star shape. He realized that this layout would make it much easier to protect the village if it ever came under attack. Just as he was considering this, one of the knights burst into the room and announced that emissaries from a neighboring county, Ferdinando, had arrived. Shortly afterward, Art and Panamera entered Van's office. Panamera introduces herself first, explaining that she is a viscountess who had risen from the rank of knight. Art introduces herself as the youngest daughter of the house of Ferdinando. She explains that she has come to the village to pay her respects, following her father's instructions. Shortly afterward, everyone sits down to talk. Van speaks bluntly, saying that he thinks they should come to observe the village, assess the state of their enemy, and learn from what has been achieved here. Panamera bursts out laughing, amazed that someone as young as 8 years old, like Van, is already able to think so strategically. Since Van has been entrusted with this land, Ferdinando County is worried that he might lead his father's ambitions in the future, which is why they are cautious around him. However, Van reassures them not to worry about that. He explains that he was merely exiled to this village because he was unable to use elemental magic, and nothing more. Panamera immediately calls this out as a lie. She has seen how much the village has developed and estimates that around 5,000 people must have been involved in its construction. Van remains quiet for a moment, letting her speak, and then suddenly bursts into laughter. He says that rather than explaining how the village developed so quickly, he would prefer to simply show them. They all move out into the open, and Van demonstrates his magic. He uses production magic to create blocks and structures with incredible speed and precision. Neither Panamera nor Art can believe what they are seeing. When Van explains that he has a special aptitude for production magic, Art immediately has a flashback to her own childhood. Van goes on to tell them that his father drove him out of the kingdom after discovering that he had production magic. Panamera thinks that was an incredibly foolish move, as the king could have used Van's talent to expand the kingdom. By now, Panamera is already mostly convinced of Van's abilities. She admits that the main reason she came here was to offer Art's hand in marriage to him. This would ensure that the village and Ferdinando County avoid any conflicts in the future. Van, however, says there is no need for marriage. As long as Ferdinando does not take any extreme actions, there will be no reason for conflict. Panamera admits that she had initially been against the idea because she assumed Van would be like all the other arrogant nobles, but after seeing what kind of person he truly is, she now supports the idea of him marrying Art. She even admits that if it were not for the age difference, she might have considered marrying Van herself. She turns to Art and asks what she thinks about marrying Van. Art replies that she is not sure yet and needs more time to think about it. Panamera reassures her not to worry, explaining that they will be spending spending the night in the village, which will give Art a full day to consider it. Van agrees to let them stay and, in less than 5 minutes, uses his magic to create a high-quality inn for them. Later that night, they have dinner together. Art spends most of the meal talking with Van and observing his character. She notices how honest, kind, and responsible he is, and slowly begins to feel herself falling for him, as well as for the people of the village. After dinner, Van walks his 2 guests to their rooms. When they reach the doors, Panamera simply tells him good night and goes inside, while Art thanks Van for everything he has done that day. She awkwardly wishes him good night as well. A little while later, Van realizes something important. Since Art was sent to him as a marriage offering, it is likely that she was also cast out of her village for not being an elemental mage. Understanding this, Van sees that she and he are not so different. From that point on, he decides to prioritize Art's wishes and comfort in every decision he makes. That night, before going to bed, Art hugs her pillow and thinks about tomorrow. She plans to try to initiate some conversation with Van. For the first time in a long while, she finds herself genuinely looking forward to waking up and seeing what the new day will bring. The next day, Van is woken up by Till and Kamzan. They tell him to come over to the lake right now because they just saw something strange. Van feels a little reluctant to get out of bed, especially since it is really early in the morning. But after they both insist for a while, he finally gets up and follows them. When he reaches the lake, he sees a group of the villagers gathered around it. Van moves to the front and is surprised to see what looks like a mermaid floating in the water, with her head sticking out above the surface. Esparta explains that this creature is called an akpalu. They are a rare species that people hardly ever meet, so Van can't help but wonder what brought this one to their village. Van tries speaking to her, but she ignores him and continues staring. He decides that offering food might show friendship, so he gives her a plate of meat. When he sets it toward the water, she immediately swims over and asks if she can have it. Van says yes, and she takes a piece and eats it. She quickly notices that this is not normal meat from regular animals, but armored lizard meat. She asks where it came from and who defeated it. Everyone knows Van would be too modest to admit he was the one who defeated it, so they all speak up and say it was by Van's power. The Akpalu hears this and immediately dives back into the water, heading back to where she came from. Esparta sees this and recalls that Akpalas are rarely seen, so they probably won't be around for a while. But Esparta is wrong. The next day, an entire village of Akpelas arrives at their lake. Van is especially surprised because he wonders if they came back because they heard he defeated the armored lizards, so it makes him think they were considered powerful gods or something. However, Esparta immediately says that this is not true because he has never heard of anything like that before. One big, intimidating Akpalu says he wants to speak with Van. He asks Van if he really was the one who defeated the armored lizards. When Van confirms it, every Akpalu in the water gasps in shock because they cannot believe a boy as young as him could defeat the armored lizards. The man then introduces himself as Latavesta, the ruler of the Akpalas. He also mentions that the girl Van met yesterday is his daughter, Priora, and he is giving her to Van for marriage. Van is immediately shocked and surprised to hear this, especially because Priora is still a child and probably doesn't even know what marriage means. Van asks Latavesta if there is a specific reason why he is offering his daughter's hand in marriage. Latavesta nods and says that there is indeed a reason. He explains that for many years, their village has been attacked and threatened by armored lizards. These creatures have caused fear and trouble for the people, making life dangerous. So when he heard that there was a lord in this village who was strong and capable enough to defeat them, he thought that offering his daughter as a bride would help protect his people and make an alliance with someone powerful. Van listens carefully and slowly realizes that Latavesta is not offering his daughter out of personal reasons or family wishes, but purely as a way to form an alliance and keep his village safe. With this understanding, Van tells Latavesta that there is no need for the marriage. He promises that he will do his best to protect the Akpolis from any danger that comes their way, without requiring Priora to marry him. Latavesta looks surprised. He did not expect Van to respond so calmly and kindly. Still, he says that if Van insists, their village is willing to move into the settlement to be closer to protection and safety. Van has no problem with this arrangement, so he immediately begins building a large resting area for them, a place where they can relax, gather, and feel comfortable. When Latavesta sees the resting area, he is amazed. He cannot believe that Van could construct such a large and well-planned space in such a short amount of time. The Akpolis move into the new resting area, and they quickly start enjoying themselves. But just as things are settling, Esparta comes to Van to remind him that it is almost time to take care of the village sewage. Van smiles and tells Esparta not to worry. He already planned a system. Pipes run under every house in the village, so all they need to do is release water from the lake, which will flush all the waste through the pipes and keep the village clean. Latavesta watches this carefully and finds it fascinating. He is impressed by Van's clever thinking and offers to help with the process. Van tells him it is not necessary, especially since the anicaps just arrived and should not be burdened. However, Latavesta insists, explaining that they are skilled with water and can handle the task well. Van finally agrees, allowing some of the anicaps to take care of opening the dam, releasing water to flush the waste. After the work is done, Van thanks everyone sincerely for their help. Latavesta observes that this flushing process is something that needs to be done several times every day. He suggests that they take on this task regularly as their way of contributing and helping to maintain the village while living there. Van thinks this is an excellent idea and a huge help, so he thanks Latavesta once again for the thoughtful suggestion. Just then, Art and Panamera arrive. They are completely shocked when they see Latavesta because they have never seen an anicaps in real life before. Right before Latavesta leaves, he refers to Van as his son-in-law. This makes Art a little jealous because it sounds like Van has already married an anicaps. Van quickly denies this, trying to explain, but before he can say more, Priora suddenly jumps out of the water and calls Van her husband before swimming away. This only makes the situation even more awkward. To clear things up, Van takes Art out on a quiet lake cruise. He explains everything to her, reassuring her that nothing has happened between him and Priora. After talking for a while, Art finally understands that it was just a huge misunderstanding. They spend the next few minutes talking and enjoying each other's company. But just then, Priora and a group of her friends swim over to their boat. Priora sees Van alone with Art and feels a little jealous. Van quickly reminds her that they are not married in the first place, which makes Priora upset. She submerges herself in the water, clearly showing her frustration. The other anicaps notice that Van made their princess unhappy, so they start rocking the boat back and forth. Both Van and Priora are scared as the boat tips from side to side. Later, Latavesta puts on a serious expression after hearing that Van was flirting with Art. Even though Priora is around, Van tries to explain that he and Priora are not engaged, but Latavesta interrupts him. He suggests holding a competition to settle the matter. He says that if the anicaps win, Van will officially become engaged to Priora. Van thinks this idea is completely ridiculous. Suddenly, Dee appears and immediately accepts the challenge, telling everyone to bring it on. The rest of the group, eager to defeat the anicaps, fully supports the idea. Eventually, they convince Van to go along with it. Van is given the choice of deciding the first contest. He suggests a simple game of volleyball. No one there has ever seen or heard of this game before, so they think it is another one of Van's clever ideas. But Dee and Panamera are more excited about the swimsuits than the game itself. The first round is set. Till and Panamera will play against Latavesta and Priora. The game begins, and Van is quickly surprised at how good the anicaps are. They are far better than he expected, winning round after round and easily dominating the human team. Till feels frustrated and thinks about giving up, but Panamera gives him a few words of encouragement. With renewed focus, Till and Panamera manage to score a few points, bringing the game close to match point. Despite their efforts and teamwork, their motivation is not enough to beat the anicaps. In the end, Latavesta and Priora win the first round decisively. Since Van chose the last challenge, Latavesta reminds him that it is now his turn to pick the next one. Latavesta wants it to be a swimming relay race. The moment Van hears this, he realizes it is extremely unfair. The anicaps are naturally excellent swimmers, and he knows they will have a huge advantage. Suddenly, Van feels the pressure. If he loses this competition, he could be forced to marry Priora. Dee steps forward and volunteers to be one of Van's swimmers. Kamzan volunteers as well, so now Van has both of his best candidates ready. The race begins, and Kamzan gives his all to keep up with Priora. She is very fast, but Kamzan pushes hard and even manages to get ahead of her for a short time before handing off to Dee. Dee takes over and immediately dominates the race. His powerful butterfly strokes carry him far ahead, leaving the anicaps struggling to catch up. Van watches in surprise as Dee swims flawlessly and wins the race. Latavesta cannot believe it. He wonders how his team could have lost, especially since they are part fish and naturally strong swimmers. However, Latavesta is not ready to give up hope. There is still one more contest to decide the outcome. It is now Van's turn to choose the next challenge. He accepts his earlier win and thinks carefully. Then, he quickly creates an ice maker and announces that the next event will be a shaved ice speed eating challenge. Art notices that she hasn't participated in anything so far and volunteers immediately. Van also volunteers to join the contest. They all head to the resting area to begin the challenge. At first, everyone takes a few spoonsful of ice and suffers from brain freezes, but they push through the discomfort. Van is determined to avoid having to marry Priora, and Art is determined to win for Van, so they use that as motivation to keep going. Together, they manage to finish the contest first, winning the challenge completely. Latavesta, showing good sportsmanship, offers Van a handshake before swimming away, but he still calls Van his son-in-law and reminds him to take care of Priora. Van sighs, frustrated that even after winning, Latavesta speaks as if the marriage is still inevitable. Meanwhile, Everyone congratulates Van for his performance, surrounding him with smiles and praise. Art watches Van surrounded by happy faces and feels inspired. She has never experienced anything like this before. As a child, her parents always neglected her because they thought she was a failure. She was timid and never excelled at anything. That changed when she learned marionette magic, which allowed her to move her dolls freely. For the first time, she hoped her mother would be proud of her. Instead, her mother slapped her, saying that marionette magic was evil and forbidden among the nobles. After that, Art became an outcast. When she turned 10, she was arranged to be engaged to Van. She expected him to be like the rude nobles she had known, but Van was different. He was kind and patient, and he had an unusual talent for production magic, considered useless by noble standards. Despite that, he was confident and used his magic to help the village. Seeing Van's example, Art decides she wants to be like him. She tells herself that if she tries harder, she can see the world as Van does. The next morning, Van holds a meeting with all the villagers. He announces that they need to construct additional ramparts for the village's future development. He also explains that since tomorrow is their day off, they'll be having a big barbecue tonight. This excites all the villagers, and they get to work with renewed enthusiasm. In that same instant, Art approaches Van and asks if she can watch him work. Van agrees, allowing her to learn from him. While this is happening, deep in the forest, Ortho and the other adventurers are being chased by something powerful and dangerous, signaling that another challenge is approaching. That was episode 5. Subscribe to not miss the next part and watch the next video on screen.